Welcome to our presentation today on outdated notion, teaching plagiarism as theft. I am so excited to have you all here with me today for this presentation. I will say that I've given outdated notions presentations where I've talked about many outdated notions at once, and this was one of the ones that I've talked about, but I've never given a full presentation. So this was the first time I really had to develop my ideas in this kind of longer format. So I'm not sure how it's going to go, but hopefully it should go well. We'll see. So if folks don't know me, my name is Jane Hammonds. I'm an associate professor and a teaching and learning engagement librarian at the Ohio State University Libraries. You can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. And I'm happy to talk more about any of this with you if you are interested in doing so. I want to give some quick acknowledgments. First, I want to acknowledge my colleagues from the University of New Mexico Libraries, including Adrienne Warner, who's here today, Alyssa Russo, who is, I think, also here today, as well as Lori Townsend and Glenn Coling. They developed the original Outdated Notions presentation that they gave at the Willow Conference in 2023. And I went to their presentation and I found it so great that I said, do you mind if I get in on this, basically? And so they've been very gracious to allow me to join in with the work that they are doing. And so I really appreciate them getting this conversation started and letting me be a part of the work that they've done here. I want to thank you all for being here today, taking time out of your day to join us, to share, to engage as you are comfortable doing so. And then I also want to give a shout out to a presentation that I saw at ACRL in 2020, I guess, or 2021. I can't remember. It was still during the pandemic year. That was called Under Pressure, Rethinking How We Teach Plagiarism by Natalie Hill and Laura Tadina. I really trace my sort of expanding thinking on how we teach plagiarism to seeing that presentation. So wanted to give a shout out to those as important first step in the way that I started to reconceptualize or rethink about how we might teach about plagiarism. If you have been to some of our presentations before, so we've given a couple of different versions of Outdated Notions presentations. So I've got some links here on the screen if you missed these. So we have had a couple Outdated Notions presentations that focused on multiple outdated notions in one presentation. And then because those presentations didn't give us a chance to really dive deeply into those particular notions, we decided to give some presentations focusing on more specific outdated notions. So hopefully some of you had a chance to be here last week when Adrienne and Alyssa gave a fantastic presentation on the idea that scholarly articles are the gold standard. If you didn't get a chance to see that presentation, it is linked here in the slides, and we're happy to send you the recording and the slides if you're interested in seeing that. And so today is the second follow-up presentation to those where we're going to focus more specifically on this idea of teaching plagiarism as theft as a potential outdated notion. So we will have a lot of options for folks to participate today, polls, chat, Q&A. Participation is very much encouraged but not required. I will ask if you have general comments or resources that you would like to share, please place those in the chat. But if you do have a specific question that you would like me to answer, please use the Q&A option for that. Since we do have a lot of folks here today, I think the chat could potentially go pretty fast, and I don't want to miss any questions. So if you do have questions that you would like me to answer, please go ahead and place those in the Q&A. And I'll ask you, if possible, not to use the raised hand feature, just because we do have so many folks here today, almost 275 people, which is amazing. That we won't really have time to let folks to use the raise hand feature. But if you have any questions about anything, please go ahead and do just add them to the chat. Adrienne is thankfully watching that for me. So any questions or issues, please place those in the chat there. If you have resources or videos related to teaching plagiarism that you would like to share, I put together a Padlet so that you can share that there. I'll put those links in the chat one more time. Hopefully everyone should have access to that. Those will be just a shared community resource where you can add articles, you can add videos, guides, tutorials that you have for teaching plagiarism, anything that you think might be helpful to the community. Please feel free to go ahead and add those resources there. I tried to add several of the articles that I'm going to talk about in there already, so those should already be in there. But again, feel free to add additional resources that you would like to share with others in the community. So what we're going to do today, we're going to spend most of the time is going to be talking about this idea of plagiarism as theft and concerns that I have about this idea, and looking at a couple of different potential reasons why I find this problematic. And then I'm going to try to share a little bit about sort of how we can rethink the approach to teaching plagiarism going forward. I did want to have a quick note. So someone was mentioning earlier in the chat about AI and how it's like raising plagiarism to even, a greater concern. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about AI today. I do recognize that it has impacted the conversation about plagiarism in many different ways, in terms of thinking about the ability that students have to plagiarize, how often they might be plagiarizing, our ability to determine if a student is plagiarizing. I do want to acknowledge that I know AI has had a really big impact on the conversation about plagiarism. But since the focus of the presentation today is really about how we characterize or how we frame plagiarism, for me, it's less important whether the plagiarism occurs during a traditional way, or whether it occurs using AI. Because we're not really going to be talking about, how plagiarism occurs or how often, but we're talking about how we frame and think about plagiarism as an offense or plagiarism as a violation. So in many ways, I don't really think that AI makes a significant difference in that way, although I'm going to talk about it in one particular way, and you'll see when we get there. So I just wanted to have that as a quick note about if you were thinking that this was going to be heavily AI focused. And I did want to just a preliminary sort of final note here. I know that what I'm talking about today may be considered controversial for some folks. Not everyone may agree with the perspective that I present. I'm totally open to different perspectives. If you don't agree, that's totally fine. You'll have several chances throughout to kind of share your agreement or disagreement. And then I did just want to mention that these opinions are my own and should not be taken as representative of the Ohio State University or the Ohio State University libraries. All right, so thinking about plagiarism as theft, let's jump into this. So when we think about how we describe plagiarism, the metaphor of theft is a very common one, right? This tends to be the way that we often present and talk about plagiarism among ourselves and with our students, that plagiarism as theft. And so I really want to talk about today, what this quote talks about, like, what is our reliance on this metaphor? What are the consequences of that? What are the consequences about, how we interact with students, our relationship with students, what we think students are doing? So what are the impacts of having this framing of plagiarism as theft be the way that we often talk about this? And is this a way that is really the best way that we could be talking about plagiarism with students? Are there other potential options or approaches that we could take in terms of talking about plagiarism? I really just wanted to share some examples, showing how pervasive this notion of plagiarism as theft is. So I went into the Adobe stock and I typed in plagiarism, and these are the images, some of the examples of images that come in up when you talk about plagiarism. So here, the robber running away, right? So thieves, people that are stealing other people's ideas. So these are some of the images of plagiarism that you see. These are some of the definitions of plagiarism, and you can find out there are, of course, many other ones. I highlighted or bolded, some of the key words there, right? Stealing, plagiarism is stealing, to steal, theft. I really wanted to bring attention to this last definition from the University of Akron. Talks about just as stealing money or car is a crime, presenting ideas and words as if they were your own is a crime. I want to highlight that because I want to come back to that a little bit later on. But I just wanted to share a few examples to kind of show the pervasiveness of this idea of plagiarism as theft. And as we think about, how students are identified as plagiarism, as plagiarizing, and what the process is that It very much, in many cases, and this may not be the case at every institution, but in many institutions, it very much is presented in a judicial model, right? Language of cases and suspects and accusations, right? And presenting evidence. And then there's a group who provide the verdict, right? So as this Sanders talks about, right, what is striking about the process is the degree to which it is framed and elaborated as a judicial process, right? Okay, so wanted to have a chance here to see what you all think and what your experience is like. So I have a couple of poll questions here. The first one is, does the description of plagiarism at your institution, or if you want to just focus on your library, include words such as stealing, theft, or crime? And then I just wanted to see what your initial reaction was about whether you agree or disagree that plagiarism should be characterized as theft or a crime. So I'm going to open a poll here. Hopefully folks should actually be seeing the poll. Let me see, I'm not sure. Okay, so are folks seeing the poll, hopefully? Yep, I see some responses are coming in. Great, some thumbs up there. So I'll give everyone a little bit of time to share their response there. All right, we'll give it about 10 more seconds to let folks have a chance to share their response. Looks like the responses are slowing down. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the poll, share the results. All right, so our first question, does the description of plagiarism at your institution include words such as stealing, theft, or crime? And it seems like about 32% of you say yes, it does. 27% say no, and most folks are sort of more in the middle, not really sure, which is totally fine as well. 42% not sure. The next one is plagiarism should be characterized as stealing, theft, or a crime. So it looks like we have about 45% that are in that not sure category. And then we have about 27% that disagree, 7% that strongly disagree, and smaller percentages agree or strongly agree. Which I think all of those responses are totally valid responses. You know, if you think plagiarism should be characterized as stealing or a crime, and you continue to think that after this presentation as well, that is totally fine. And for those of you that are not sure, you know, I hope today will help you to think about this idea a little bit more and you know, consider your own perspective on that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Here, forward. All right, so I wanted to just take a minute to actually think about the legal position, right? Is plagiarism actually a crime? So within the United States, from what I have been able to tell, and I am not a lawyer, but from what I have been able to tell and find, right, plagiarism is generally not considered to actually be a crime, right? It is not considered to actually be illegal. Now, there are, of course, cases where plagiarism might also be copyright infringement or patent, you know, violation, trademark violation, and those kinds of cases. Yes, then you might be prosecuted. Or if plagiarism is something, might be like fraud in the sense of you were paid to create an original work and you did not, you know, then that could be considered a crime. But in general, plagiarism itself is technically generally not considered to be a crime in the United States. I found this really interesting quote, right? That this idea of that no plagiarist has ever been prosecuted for theft, right? So there may be cases in which, you know, someone who plagiarizes does get prosecuted, but it's generally not actually for theft. You know, it might be for copyright infringement or fraud. I don't know if that's, you know, completely the case. That was a quote from early 2000s. So, it may have changed, but from my understanding of the law, and if I am completely wrong, someone can please feel free to correct me, that plagiarism is not actually itself considered to be a crime. And I see some folks going in there to that it's more like a civil court action, right? Results in civil penalties, which I think, yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. Great. All right. So I did want to highlight really quickly the difference between plagiarism and copyright infringement. In some cases, they are presented as the same thing or similar. I did find one example, for example, on the website of the Citadel. I don't know if anyone from the Citadel here today, but they have anytime you borrow from an original source and do not give proper credit, you have committed plagiarism and violated US copyright laws. However, from my understanding, right, that this is actually just not the case. It is very easy to plagiarize without violating copyright, without committing copyright infringement, right? So if you copy from a work in the public domain, that is plagiarism. That may be plagiarism, but it is not copyright infringement, right? And vice versa, you can have copyright infringement and have it not be plagiarism, right? So although they are often presented as the same thing or very similar, they're actually legally distinct, or that copyright infringement and plagiarism. So I just wanted to highlight that as a difference. All right. So if we go with the idea that plagiarism is generally not actually considered a crime, what are potential justifications for describing plagiarism as a crime or theft when we talk with students? One potential justification is that it's just because it is so serious, right? This is something that we take very seriously in the academy, and we want to make sure that our students understand that as well, right? So this language is a way that we can convey to our students the seriousness of this situation. By doing so, we may be, socializing students into the norms of academic and professional communities where plagiarism is taken very seriously, right? And I think, of course, the big hope is that if we instill fear in students, they are going to be likely less likely to plagiarize, right? So if we make it clear that this is a very serious issue, right, that they are going to get in serious trouble for this, right, that our hope is that they may be less likely to commit plagiarism with this perspective, right? Right. So that's sort of the justification that we may see for, at least some of the justifications that we may see for talking about plagiarism as theft. My position, what I'm going to argue, and again, I know that not everyone will agree with me, and that is totally fine. My position is that I think that talking about plagiarism as theft does more harm than good. And I'm going to give several different reasons why I think this is the case. Not all of these may resonate with everyone. Not all of these, I'm not going to spend the same amount of time on all of them. But these are the things, and kind of researching this topic in my own experience, that seem to me reasons why I think that this is actually a harmful way for us to talk about plagiarism. So I did want to clarify here that I'm not saying that we should just make it a free for all. I do think that we need to teach students about plagiarism. I am not at all saying that we don't tell students what plagiarism is, that we don't talk to students about plagiarism. I'm not saying that we can't tell students that plagiarism is unacceptable. I think we do want to tell students that. And I do think that when students plagiarize, there should be consequences. But I'm not sure from my own perspective if the consequence is that they are treated as a criminal is the best way to go about what we hope to achieve by talking to students about plagiarism. So I do think that plagiarism is important to talk about. It's a serious issue. I'm really thinking about the framing that we have for how we talk about plagiarism with students. All right. So one of the reasons why I think that talking about plagiarism as theft and a crime is that it can create a significant amount of anxiety in our students. And I don't know about you, but I myself have many times become extremely anxious about plagiarism in my own work. What if I did it and I don't realize it, right? And I found these examples, and you can find other examples of students talking amongst themselves, ones on Reddit, on other student forums, where they're like, I get so anxious about this. And I spend all of this time focusing on making sure that my citations are perfect. And I worry and worry and worry about it, right? And it may be that, a little bit of anxiety is a good thing, right? But do we want our students to be spending all of their time worrying about whether their citations are perfect? What does that do to actually what they're learning about the assignment, or from doing the assignment? If they're all of the focus is proper citation formats and making sure that I've noted everything and all of that. So I think that this idea of plagiarism anxiety, is real, and could be a potential reason why. I was talking about this with one of my colleagues earlier, and she was saying that one of her students had been told, like, she could go to jail for this, right? And do we really want students? Are students thinking that they're going to go to jail for not including a citation or even copying pasting, right? It seems kind of an extreme reaction to um, try to elicit in students, right? So plagiarism anxiety is one reason, right? So I wanted to do another quick poll here to jump into before I talk about my next reason. So in this example here, the student writes a paper and copies directly from a paper that is called Plagiarize This Paper, which was written by Brian Fry. The student does not provide any attribution, right? In the paper, Fry clearly writes that he explicitly authorizes plagiarism of the article. He does not want any credit for the article. However, the instructor still considers this to be plagiarism and reports the student to their academic misconduct committee. So I wanted to have your all's perspective on this situation. So the student read a paper that explicitly says, I want you to plagiarize this paper, but gets in trouble for doing so. So I'm going to go ahead and do our second poll here, and hopefully folks should be able to see these questions. All right, so hopefully you should be seeing that poll here. So the first question is what the student did plagiarism, right? They copied from a paper where they were given permission to plagiarize. And should the instructor support that, report that student for plagiarism? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so hopefully folks should be able to see the results there. So the student copies from a paper where they are given explicit permission to plagiarize. So it seems like almost the majority, 49%, still consider this to be plagiarism. With the rest of folks either saying no, they don't think it's plagiarism, or they're not sure. So our question will be going forward, thinking about these next couple of issues, is if this is plagiarism, why is this plagiarism? So we'll think about that going forward. And the instructor should support this student for plagiarism. So we do have about 10% who say that they think, yes, the instructor should. It looks like almost half of folks say no, they should not. And if you bring that together, the degree and strongly disagree, we have 60 some percent who think that the instructor should not report this student. All right. So I just want to share this as an example as we move into this next reason. So the next reason that I want to share is that talking about plagiarism as theft with students doesn't make sense to students. Right. So there's been studies and research and discussion about students have grown up in an age in which they've had constant access to the internet and all types of social media, and information seems to be free to them, right? And so they are very used to this culture of sharing and easy access, and, piracy and downloading things. So, maybe they have a fundamentally different understanding of plagiarism than we do as academics. And so, if we talk about plagiarism with that as stuff with students, that they really don't get it, right? And the last one quote here I have highlighted, right? Even for students who think stealing is wrong, plagiarism doesn't look like normal theft to them. So I wanted to highlight that as we move into this next step, right? All right. So if plagiarism is theft, what is being stolen? Right. So if you look at sort of legal definitions of theft, theft is defined as taking the property of another with the intent to deprive the rightful owner of its use. Right. So if you go back to that definition of plagiarism that we talked about earlier, that was, I think, the University of Akron, right? That compared plagiarism to stealing someone's car or stealing money from them, right? In those cases, if you take someone else's car, they no longer have access to that use. But what is actually being stolen when we talk about plagiarism as theft, right? So as scholars, right, we don't lose the right to use those words if someone else uses them as well. In most cases, right, as scholars, we actually want other people to use our work. We want people to use our words and to share our words and to share our ideas, right? So what's being stolen, right, is not really the words, um, it is the credit, right? And that's the argument that several scholars have been made, right? The only way that really plagiarism kind of really fits into this idea of theft is if we think about what's being stolen is the credit, and not the actual words themselves. So if we go back to the poll question about um, whether or not that student committed plagiarism, even though they were given explicit permission by the author to do so, right? If we think that that's plagiarism, how can that plagiarism definition be based around theft? Because that person gave away that item, right? If I give someone my car, then that's not theft. And that author gave away their words to that student. But a lot of folks still felt that that was plagiarism. And I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm saying if we think that's plagiarism, what is it? Is it really because something was being stolen? That author gave away their work, they gave away their credit. They say explicitly in the article that I don't want any attribution. Um, and so if we still think that that student plagiarized, then the plagiarism as theft notion doesn't really work with that, at least from my perspective. And I may be, off there. I'm not sure how clearly I explained that. But that's sort of what I wanted us to think about is, what is actually being stolen when we think about plagiarism as theft, and um, if we think things are plagiarism, even if they are given permission to use the words, then there's something else that we're really thinking that plagiarism is. Right. So sort of a second kind of closely related aspect to this is this idea that plagiarism doesn't make sense to students as theft, but we could also talk about it not making sense when applied to students. Right. So if we think about plagiarism norms as being intended to ensure that the public gets accurate information and that the author gets public credit, the overwhelming majority of students, as Fry says, are not producing scholarship for public consumption, right? So that it makes no sense to apply academic norms, this idea of plagiarism as theft, to assignments unless doing so provides a pedagogical benefit. And again, not everyone may agree with this perspective. Obviously, we do have some students who are producing scholarship for public consumption. But even in those cases, right, is an author really losing credit if an undergraduate student does not cite them in their poster presentation? What credit are they actually losing? They probably won't even ever know, right, that a student used their words, right? And so we are telling students that they are stealing something from someone who has no idea and is in no way harmed by that, right? So, just a way to think about and consider how we might want to change our perspective here. So I actually forgot to set this poll up. So we'll just try to do this with chat if we can really quickly. So in this case, for an example, the student writes a paper in her sociology course, and she takes several sentences from slides that she takes directly from the slides that her instructor provides in class, and she does not provide a citation for this information. So is this plagiarism? So if you want to share in the chat really quickly, just yes or no, or if you're not sure, does taking sentences from the instructor's slides constitute plagiarism? So we'll just let folks have a chance to share their response there. So looks like most folks are saying yes. Some folks technically yes. So the next question is, would you report this? So, or would you encourage the instructor to report this? So as we see the comments coming through, it looked like a lot of folks would say that technically, yes, they think that this does count as plagiarism, or it probably counts as plagiarism, but that they probably would not report it, or maybe would not encourage the instructor to report it. So several folks are talking about this as a teaching moment, right? Yes, absolutely. Teaching moment. Yeah, great, great. Yeah. So the point that I wanted to make related to this poll is, we had most folks agree that it was plagiarism, but some folks were not sure. And there may be other cases where folks are like, I don't really think that's plagiarism at all. So I think that this plagiarism as theft metaphor really ignores the complexity of trying to identify what actually is plagiarism. We really sort of assume that we're all talking about the same thing when we talk about plagiarism, but that isn't necessarily the case, right? And if you actually try to read and go through plagiarism, guidelines or resources that are provided, they can be very different, right, from different institutions. They can be interpreted different ways. Fry, the author in the quote on the bottom, went through his institution's plagiarism policy and tried to point out all of the things that were completely unclear, and came to the conclusion that he had no idea how students could be anything but unsure about what constituted plagiarism after reading his institute's plagiarism policy. So this idea that, if I steal something from you, it's clear that I have taken that thing away from you. But a lot of the things that we talk about plagiarism, how clear is it really? How much in agreement are we always on what actually constitutes plagiarism? And I love this image. This was actually from a blog post I saw from the Visual Communication Guy, trying to demonstrate how to determine whether or not you've plagiarized, right? And this highlights 13 different types of potential plagiarism that a student might have. And you can see this very complicated flow chart of questions of trying to determine whether or not someone has plagiarized. If something is this complicated to determine, does the metaphor of theft, which seems very straightforward, actually work, right? Theft is you take something or you didn't take something, right? But we have this very complicated flow chart to try to determine whether or not something is plagiarism. So for me, it just seems like the theft metaphor doesn't work really well with a topic this complicated. I wanted to highlight as well this idea of this it not making sense and it not being really clear to determine what plagiarism is. Also ignores the idea that there are many cultural differences in how plagiarism is understood. That this is not a universal concept. Plagiarism is very based in this Western view of intellectual property, something that can be bought and owned, which is not shared by all cultures, right? And so we may have students coming from very different backgrounds and perspectives who may have a completely different understanding of what plagiarism is, right? I wanted to highlight this idea that this plagiarism as theft metaphor can create a really adversarial relationship between the instructor and the student, right? Or the librarian and the student, right? I love this quote from Rob Jenkins, right? Either you can be a teacher or you can be the plagiarism police. What does it say about what we think about our students is, that we're already assuming that they're going to be be committing crimes, right? If we think about them as criminals, right, and how does that impact how they think about themselves, right? How does that impact how they understand what plagiarism is? We think about this idea that most students aren't going to, they don't think about themselves as criminals, and yet they're being accused of this crime that they don't really understand, right? So, and they feel that instructors, that their institutions are predisposed to finding them guilty. If we go back to the idea of plagiarism anxiety that students express, they think that they are going to be found guilty even if they haven't done anything wrong, right? So what does this do to our ability to have a good relationship with our students if the theft metaphor is the one that we are going with, right? I don't have any actual evidence in terms of like research studies for this. But I know, some of the things I've read, talks about a lot of instructors like to deal with plagiarism cases sort of on an individual basis because, part of this may be because they are reluctant to involve themselves and reluctant to involve their students in what they see as this sort of legal process, right? They would rather handle it, as many folks had in the chat, as a teaching moment, right? Rather than as something where I feel I need to automatically report my student for doing something wrong. I want to have this as this educational moment instead, right? And then that kind of leads into this, right? Sort of the big uh, point, right? That it doesn't really support learning if we are talking about plagiarism as students with theft and we are accusing students of a crime the first time they do something wrong, right? We know that learning the norms of academic culture is not easy. It takes a long time, right? We have to have the opportunity to make mistakes. Making mistakes is part of it, that is how we learn, right? And so if we treat all situations the same and we say the first violation, you are getting reported, right? That doesn't make this a learning that give it a learning opportunity at all, right? Other things that students do wrong, if they do their math homework wrong, we don't report them for getting to the wrong answer. We say, okay, this is a learning opportunity, right? There's something that you're not getting that we need to talk about, right? But in this case, if we go right to we're reporting our students, right? This is not a learning opportunity for us. We're not allowing them to make mistakes in this very complicated uh, topic that we can't all agree on what actually constitutes plagiarism, right? And we have these very difficult to read plagiarism policies, and yet we're expecting novice learners to get this right the first time, all the time, right? And we're giving very severe punishments if they don't. Um, all right. So one more thing, and then we'll kind of wrap up and kind of move to the second part really quickly. So a last kind of question here. So I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about AI, and this is the one exception here. So if a student includes sentences or paragraphs in their paper written by an AI tool without providing attribution, is this plagiarism? Do you want to just share your answer in the chat really quickly? Students use sentences or paragraphs in their paper written by an AI tool. Is this plagiarism? See, it seems like we have a lot of plagiarism. And one person sort of said what I was planning to say, right? So I think that this is another way to think about the limits of this theft metaphor and how well this metaphor works, right? Plagiarism is often defined as stealing another person's ideas, right? But the AI tool is not a person, right? And so if we still think that using an AI tool is plagiarism, and I think I agree with those folks that are saying yes, right? If we still think that that is plagiarism, we're not really talking about theft there, right? Because there's no person to steal from, right? So what actually are we talking about then? What actually is what the student is doing wrong? Or are they stealing, or is there something else, right? That they are doing wrong. So I think that thinking about AI can help us think about the limits of this idea of thinking about plagiarism as stealing someone else's ideas or even stealing someone else's credit. And are there other ways that we can characterize and think about plagiarism? All right, so I wanted to pause here to see if there are any questions. I know we're already running out of time. So actually, maybe I will wait until the end and just kind of really quickly go through the next slide. So I want to give us a few a little bit of time at the end to actually do have some questions. So wanted to highlight sort of my way that we want to reconceptualize thinking about plagiarism. And I support this idea of a more empathetic approach to plagiarism, where we talk about plagiarism as a mistake. And it can be, we can talk about it as a serious mistake, but not talking about plagiarism as a crime. And going back to the point that several folks have already been made and highlighting in the chat, talking about plagiarism as a learning opportunity, right? We are teaching you how to be engaged into the norms of the academic community, the norms of your professional community. This is how folks in this community communicate with each other. This is how they share with each other. But I think from my perspective, I would love us to see us move away from this language of telling students that when they plagiarize, it's the same as stealing someone's car. Right? So thinking about plagiarism as a mistake. Some of the things that we can do, we can think of ourselves and if we are working with instructors, how we can help them to clarify the language so that we are making expectations clear as possible for students about what they are allowed to do and what they are not allowed to do. Clarifying the terminology about providing citations. If there's potentially options to allow students to use more functional citations or informal citations so that they're not spending so much time thinking about whether their citations are correct, and they're actually thinking more about what they're learning from by completing that assignment. We can think about it, and I know most of us are not going to be in a position necessarily to be able to redefine plagiarism as on our campuses, but we may be able to be in a position to think about how we talk about plagiarism, in a class with students, or how we have it on our LibGuides. So are there different ways that we can define plagiarism? Here's one example that I found from Fishman, which I like this definition of using ideas, words, from another person or another source, without attributing that work in a situation in which there's expectation of original scholarship or authorship in order to obtain some benefit, credit, or gain. So this is one example of how we might be able to think about how we can shift and redefine plagiarism. But there could potentially be other examples as well. So Rovalog talks a lot about emphasizing the norm of attribution. So instead of starting our conversations talking about theft, we start talking about attribution and sort of credit, right? So this norm of attribution, thinking about this as a positive, we provide citations as a way, to give appropriate attribution, to give credit to others. I like this idea that she has about helping students understand the difference between passing off and passing on. Passing off, I want you to think this idea is mine, versus passing on, I want to share this great idea that I found with you, right? Or with others. I want to talk about how this great idea impacted my work, right? So talking about the norm of attribution and giving credit rather than theft, right? And this is where we can incorporate our students' experiences. They do give credit, right? And they give credit in their everyday lives, right? In everyday situations, they understand what it feels like to, have an idea that they've, shared, be claimed, or, by others. So we can talk about how we can incorporate their experiences. This is a great way you could potentially talk about social media, right? Content creators. What does it feel like for someone as a content creator if someone else uses their work, right? So what are the benefits for content creators of getting attribution for their work? So jumping right into the scholarly conversation, they may not understand, but they understand how credit and attribution works. So we could talk about it from this perspective and use their experience to jump into that deeper conversation of attribution. One thing I think might help is to separate the teaching of citation mechanics from teaching about plagiarism, right? Because being able to provide a proper citation, helps you to avoid plagiarism, but providing accurate citations is not, teaching students about the citation format is not the same as about teaching them not to plagiarize. So maybe if we separate instruction on this, this could be a way to make it so that they're not focusing all the time on whether I've got a comma in the correct place or not, right? And making sure that as far as possible within our perspective, that we are not saying inappropriate citation format automatically counts as plagiarism, because learning these citation formats, it's complicated, right? Um, and then I think, starting the conversation from attribution, I think is one potential way. But we would also want to move beyond that, and we want to make sure that students understand that it's their intellectual contribution is what we value. We want to hear their voice, right? And they may not be aware of that, right? They may have a perspective, doing a research or papers about compiling what other people have said about this on a topic, but we want to hear their own voice, and they may not be aware of that. So if we can talk about this, and when we talk about students, what was your intellectual contribution to this work? That could be a potential way into it. Clarifying those hidden expectations. This is where I think the framework for information literacy could be helpful. Highlighting these ideas once we do get into this point where we're talking about, scholarly work, using scholarship as conversation and research as inquiry, both really clearly highlight this idea of these communities of researchers working together to develop and share knowledge. And we can use this as a way to think about, what do adding citations add to the scholarly conversation on this topic? As much as possible, and I know that we aren't all course instructors, but if we are, one of the things that we can think about is how we can avoid disposable assignments. Those assignments that the student no one else is going to look at, and they don't care about, and the instructor doesn't really care about, right? Those kinds of assignments may be ones where students may be tempted to cheat because they think it just doesn't matter, right? And they're not going to learn anything by completing that assignment. So as much as possible, if we can make our assignments meaningful to students and relate to their own experience. It doesn't work. It's hard in every case, but as much as possible, if we can avoid disposable assignments and help our students too as well. Instead of going directly to this idea of, reporting students, this is one example I found where the instructor was using dialogue and reflection, right? They had a dialogue with their students. This was the kind of the teaching moment that folks have been talked about. Like, why did you do this? What is the importance to you of authenticity and originality? And then the students wrote a reflective essay, and they found that this, seemed to be an approach that had potential for working with students. And the last thing I wanted to, I think it's really important just to acknowledge this is a very emotional topic. We can talk to our students. They have a lot of feelings about citations. They have a lot of feelings that might impact why they plagiarize. But then they also have a lot of feelings about plagiarism itself. And, there can be a lot of emotions tied up with this. And I think it could be important to acknowledge these emotional bottlenecks. I've given a couple times students an assignment where I just had them provide a description of how they felt about plagiarism. And it could be a PowerPoint, a song, a drawing, and they have a lot of feelings, right? And so letting them share, recognizing that this is an emotional topic, and this is a topic that can raise a lot of anxiety and fear, I think can be really a good way to approach this, in terms of letting them know that they're not the only one who has those feelings, right? And then a last activity that I think would be kind of interesting that you could do, first have students work together to define plagiarism, which I spelled wrong, I noticed in that slide. Compare that with the actual definitions of plagiarism, and let students think about, here's how we define plagiarism, here's how you define plagiarism. Talk through this idea of, if we define plagiarism as theft, here's what we're actually talking about here, and kind of helping them kind of unpack that metaphor a little bit. By comparing how they think about plagiarism to how we talk about plagiarism. All right, so that was really quickly. We have a few minutes left for questions. So if you do have questions, you can please put them in the Q&A so that I can make sure to catch them. And we can also see if there are any in the chat as well. So one question in the Q&A is, when does gravity increase? A first-year student is not a candidate writing a doctoral dissertation. Yes, and that is a really great point, Andrew. And yes, I think that it definitely would have to be that the consequences or the punishments do change, right, as you go forward. If it's a second violation, if it's a third violation, right, absolutely. Treating a first-year student versus a graduate student writing their dissertation has to be treated differently. So I completely recognize that. but I think that there are still ways that we could have make it clear that there's consequences are going to be serious without necessarily always going to the level of saying that our students are criminal or that they are, you keep continuing to hold on to that metaphor itself. But again, I definitely do think that there should be consequences for plagiarism. Yeah, so any advice about how to deal with the inconsistency between instructors? Many students complain about getting different info from different perspectives. Some are more strict, while others are more relaxed. And that's a really great question and a really great point. And that's when going back to that point I was making about how this metaphor might actually discourage instructors from some instructors from reporting their students, and it creates that inconsistency, right? And I think that if we moved away from this metaphor, if instructors didn't worry that they had to, if they were reporting their student that they were all going to be going through this long legal process, it might actually be easier for consistency to get consistency, right? Because instructors may be less, less worried about that and more likely to actually, impose some consequences without if they didn't feel that they always had to go through this legal process to do so. I don't know if that answer made sense, but I feel that that actually could help with that issue of inconsistent responses if we moved away from this idea of plagiarism as theft. So any other questions? And I don't see any others in the Q&A. Adrienne, were there any in the chat that you were seeing?
No, just some amazing conversation back and forth. I didn't see any questions that stuck out to me.
So I have the chat up as well. So if you have other questions, comments that you would like to share, we have about 5 more minutes left. So yeah, definitely open to additional questions, comments. It seems like something new came into the Q&A. Let me see here. There's a question in the chat about self-plagiarism. I'm not sure what exactly the question was. If that person is able to put that in the chat really quick, or in the Q&A really quickly, or in the chat. Yep, I thank you for that. Yeah, I put the links to the slides and the Padlet in there as well. But I did. Oh, go ahead, Adrienne.
Sorry, I will just mention there was a few questions maybe to each other around how to cite AI, which I know wasn't really the topic of your conversation, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts around maybe best practices or if that came up in your research as you were preparing for this presentation.
Yeah, I know that that some of the different like MLA and APA have been sort of developing some guidelines about citing AI. My emphasis would be on making sure that the students are clear that if they do use AI, they have to have some sort of acknowledgement. And I know that some instructors are being like, you have to tell me what prompt you use, those kinds of things. So I think, the most important thing for me is less about a specific citation format. It's just that students know when or if they actually have to acknowledge AI use. And I was thinking about, again, I didn't see the exact question about self-plagiarism, but unless maybe that's in there. Yes, so I think generally, yeah, so I agree with that comment that this idea that might be one of the reasons why self-plagiarism is so confusing to students because they don't really get this idea of plagiarism as theft. We talk about plagiarism as theft, but how can they be stealing from their self, right? They're giving themselves permission to use that, right? So I think that could be another a great example of that. Maybe that kind of shows the limits of that metaphor of plagiarism as theft, of why it doesn't really work. Because what we want really is we want students to produce original work, but we know that that's always going to incorporate the work of others, right? So we want students to be able to know what their intellectual contribution is and to be making an intellectual contribution in those situations where original work is expected. And, so that sort of idea of plagiarism as theft, maybe that's, another reason why it's so confusing. Self-plagiarism is so confusing to students. Or they're not really getting that this idea that the expectation of original work. Let's see. Another question. So, how do we advocate for institutional changes to these concepts? So, that is a really great question. Um, so, I think that one of the ways this could be just kind of getting a conversation started on your campus. If there are instructors, if you do any kind of teach the teacher programming, you could think about, could we have a workshop like this on our campus where we could kind of get a conversation going? Who are the people on our campus that are making these decisions? And I will admit, I have been working on a project with my own committee on academic misconduct, and I'm not sure how they would feel about this presentation, to be honest. So, maybe we can, just get the conversation started, reaching out to a few of those faculty that we work with, thinking about within the library, as we post, talk about plagiarism in our classes when instructors are there, how we think about framing that. But it is a big conversation to have to make these changes at an institutional level for sure. Mm. Um, okay, so I know that we are at the end. So everyone will be getting a follow-up email. I'll put the slides and everything in there one more time. Everyone will be getting a follow-up email with a link to the recording, the slides, the previous outdated notion sessions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and stop sharing.